In this video, we'll look at the Sassanid Persians and their Lakhmid proxies and go through just how and why understanding them is crucial to understanding how Islam and the Islamic Empire grew. The story of Islam and the Islamic Empire is very much the story of the battles and the Cold War between the Sassanid Persian Empire and the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. I say Cold War because these empires used to use other kingdoms as proxies to fight. You see, growing your empire and waging war is very expensive, and proxies are a cheaper but less controlled way of expanding your sphere of power. Now, the Sassanid Persian Empire started at the end of the Parthian Persian Empire. The Parthians were great at military campaigns, and if you've ever played Age of Empires, you'll know about Parthian tactics, which include horse archers galloping forward while firing at arrows at shoulders right behind them. However, the Parthians didn't really do a lot in terms of art, or what we today call the sciences. The Sassanids, on the other hand, quickly expanded their empire and seriously promoted scholarship. In fact, it was under the Sassanid Empire that the translation movement of Greek knowledge into other languages started, something that was later taken on by the translation movement of the Abbasid Islamic Empire. In fact, the Abbasid term Bayt al-Hikmah, or House of Knowledge, is often understood as a school of translators. But that's only half true. You see, Bayt al-Hikmah was actually just the Arabic name for a Sassanid palace library. It was later, mostly under Caliph al-Ma'mun, that they added their own works to the mix, like mathematics and geography. Other than this scholarly work, the real meat of the Sassanid Empire's impact on Islam is in its meddlings in Arabia. A lot of this was due to the management and mismanagement of its Lakhmid proxy. You see, the relationship between the Lakhmids and the Sassanids was hot and cold in the beginning, like one of those relationships where they love each other one day and are trying to drive over the other the next. The Lakhmids were a kingdom for about 300 years and built up a serious military machine in the area that we call today Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, sitting just under the huge Sassanid Empire. The Lakhmid kings from early on had this vision of a single king of Arabia. We know this from funeral inscriptions of an early ruler, Imru al-Qais. This King of Arabia concept was super important to the Arab Muslims much later on, and we'll talk about that later. Towards the end of their kingdom, about 600 CE, the Lakhmids became very close to the Persians, even closer, and one of the Persian kings even was raised in the Lakhmid capital of Hira. And the Lakhmids collected tribute for Persia from Arabs as far as the now Islamic holy city of Medina. So what went wrong? This relationship between the Sassanids and the Lakhmids really ended after the Lakhmid king Nu'man III converted to Christianity. You see, at the time the Persian Shahanshah, or Persian King of Kings, Khosrow II, was planning an all-out war against the Byzantine Empire. And if you were a Christian, there was a suspicion that you might join up with the Christian Byzantine Empire. After Nu'man III became Christian, Khosrow poisoned his whole family in 602 CE and replaced him with this random Persian guy. But after this act, the Persians just never had any real control in Arabia anymore. This also played a huge part in the future Islamic conquest of Persia, because when the Arab Muslims began invading the Sassanid Empire, one, they didn't have that buffer zone that the Lakhmids used to provide, and two, the Lakhmids actually allied with the Muslims against Persia. This was also around the time when the Ghassanid kingdom's relationship with Byzantine was also in crisis, and the weakening of both these proxies in Arabia, the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids, created a massive power vacuum. Now, something really interesting happened here. Though we don't have a lot of contemporary sources for the few decades after the Sassanids killed Nu'man, Muslim sources that came later gave us some insights. With the absence of political direction from these neighboring powerhouses, the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, local Arab leaders stepped up to fill the power vacuums in their own regions of Arabia. The usual structures of power broke down, so where before you'd have this Lakhmid king of Arabs, kingship didn't mean as much anymore. So instead, these local leaders began to claim authority on religious grounds, arguing that they'd been called on by God to lead people. And they didn't call on pagan gods, no. They instead say they were monotheistic leader prophets. This makes sense because of the many ways that Christianity and Judaism had been established in Arabia, whether it's through the Ghassanid Christians or the Jewish Himyarites in Yemen. One of the most famous of these leader prophets was a man called Musaylima, but there was also Tulayha, Aswad, Sajah, Laqit, and Ibn Sayyid. Of course, the most famous and successful of these leader prophets was a man called Muhammad from one of the Arab settlements in the Hijazi region. It was through Muhammad's legacy that later caliphs, after his death, stabilized Arabia and took over the Sassanid Empire. What isn't clear is whether all of these other leader prophets claimed their claims to prophethood before or after Muhammad's own claims. Traditional Muslim sources tend to point to during or after, but we might never know. And remember we said that the Lakhmids always pushed the idea of a united Arabia under one ruler. Well, this idea could have certainly been adopted by these leader prophets, including Muhammad, except that the banner now was a religious rather than a monarchical one. It wasn't using kingship for power anymore, it was through using religion. But united Arab leadership isn't really enough to explain why that huge, powerful Sassanid empire fell. Why did they fall to the Muslim Arabs? Most of our research points to 3 reasons, and they all boil down to severe weakness in the Sassanid empire right before the campaigns of Umar al-Khattab, one of the most successful early caliphs. The first reason is that by the time Arab Muslim armies were at their doorstep, the Sassanids had been devastated from a full final war with Byzantine, both militarily and economically. The second reason was that a huge plague had just swept through Persia and Byzantine. When I say huge plague, I don't mean like a small flu. I mean half the population were killed by this plague. It was a bubonic plague. I'm talking half the population after the huge war with Byzantine. The third big reason was that the Shahanshah Khosrow II was killed by his own son after the big final war. A son who then died because of that plague. And 2 years before Umar al-Khattab became caliph, Yazdegerd III became Shahanshah. But Yazdegerd was only 8 years old, so this wasn't going to be pretty for the Sassanids at all. So you can see why it was so easy for the Arab armies to completely rout Persia out with the help of both the Lakhmid and the Ghassanid military. We hope this video gives you a clear idea of how the Sassanid scholarly tradition, their Bayt al-Hikmah, their tenuous relationship with Arabia and the Lakhmid king of Arabs concept impacted not just the growth of leader prophets in the region, but also the later development of the Islamic empire. That's it from Salsalah today. If you like this video, subscribe below, and if you want to support us, throw us a few dollars on our Patreon along with our other supporters. Until next time, bye bye. And 2, the Lakhmids actually joined up with the Arabs against the Persians. I don't know why I made a pause in there. This also played a huge part in future Islamic conquest of Persia. The United States of Persia.